Just like when we were kids, we're often scared of things that aren't even real, but other times we're not scared enough of the things that are real. Many investors have decided to bury their heads in the sand and carry on as if nothing's happened. In the back of their heads, perhaps selling out of equities and moving into cash back in March 2020 wasn't the best move after all. So that's playing out in the back of their heads. So what should we do? Should we take ground now when there's literally blood in the streets? Or at the very least, should we stay the course? Or should we sell up and sit this crisis out? Iran, Russia, India, China, and the US or Israel, one false move in any one of these theaters of conflict, that's all it takes. And in another realm, there's a choice central banks are making right now between destroying the worldwide economy and preserving the global financial system. In Western culture, decades of abundance now has us so focused on who has what that we've forgotten to lock the front door. We have to be careful not to allow hubris or fear to inform our investing behavior. It's far too complex out there to be thinking deterministic in any way. Investing through this time could actually be incredibly rewarding, but we have to think differently. Value versus growth, active versus passive, gold versus Bitcoin, stay invested or sit it out. Everything is right for a season, just like the clock's right twice a day, but we can't forget daylight savings. A change in one realm can quickly invert the result that you get in another. Senior lecturer at Waikato University, Dr. Reuben Steff joins me from the Czech Republic today to help me understand the changing geopolitical landscape. I don't think investors are currently being rewarded for the quantity or quality of risk present in the world today. The lack of incentive structures in the wealth management space to prepare investors for what may come next has me seriously concerned as well for the everyday investor. We need to be paying attention to what's going on right now. Now, Reuben's research, artificial intelligence, nuclear and ballistic missile deterrence theory, New Zealand and US foreign policy, and the list goes on. He's the author of 4 books. He's been on this podcast once already. And today we're covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European energy crisis, Taiwan and China, then the US and New Zealand. Buckle up. It's going to be a great chat. How are you, Reuben? You good?
Yeah, good, man. In the Czech Republic right now, there's a lot of interesting, slightly worrying things happening in this part of the world, but it's a fascinating place to be setting up shop for a year to do research. So yeah, I'm good.
That we caught up in episode 221. That would have been maybe like a week before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think we were talking about will they or won't they? And now that you're based over in the Czech Republic, I'm curious just to know what it feels like on the street, like what the vibe is. Does it kind of feel like, because I know you're in it so much that it almost doesn't matter where you are in the world, but now that you're physically there, do you kind of view things a little bit differently?
Right now, everyone's basically just going on with their day-to-day lives. The major impact that we're seeing is in the energy sphere, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit later, with people just starting to get incredibly expensive gas bills and so on. But the feeling is, I wouldn't say that strange or what you might expect from the other side of the world, but it would have been much different at the beginning of this year, I'm sure. People are paying a lot of attention to what's going on though now. So people, when the partial mobilization was announced by Putin about a week ago, everyone's paying attention to that. It's all over the media, the radio. Putin is probably going to annex these territories in the eastern part of Ukraine. So people are paying attention to that. So everyone's aware that this is kind of an important historical period of time we're living through. But the most part, people are just getting on with their lives because what else can you do, really?
I know you're a young parent. I'm a little bit further on in my journey, but how do you kind of think about that in terms of just being a family in that environment? And what do you kind of generally make of the instability just around that region right now?
Well, let's put it this way. If a single tactical nuclear weapon goes off in Ukraine, we're going to get the hell out of here, I think, and get back to New Zealand. But besides that, again, you've just got to get on with it. It's because the war is to the east, it's a few thousand kilometers from here. It's not directly affecting us outside of cost of living here going up a lot. So inflation in the Czech Republic has been 15% in the past year. Oil and gas bills are going up. We're starting to hear about cafes and restaurants that, they might pay something like 1,500 euros a month for energy. They're now getting energy bills that are like 6,000 to 7,000 euros a month. And This is going to continue into the winter. A lot of national governments here are already stepping up saying, well, look, we'll help subsidize cost of living, we'll help subsidize energy prices for businesses. Can they do that to a sufficient amount? Going to be concerned about countries like Germany, where Germany gets all this gas and oil from Russia, But that isn't just to heat people's homes. It's for their entire manufacturing sector. It's for all these industrial inputs into their economy. So if they cannot get sufficient supplies of gas in the coming months, and there's estimates that Europe is going to have a shortfall of 70 to 80 billion cubic meters of gas this year. Europe takes 400 billion in 1 year. So a loss of 60 to 70 billion is significant. And if this gets bad enough, you could see entire sectors of the European economy basically crumble in the coming months. It's these uncertainties, I think, that someone like me focuses on. And on one hand, intellectually, it's fascinating, but in the real world that we live in, it's quite concerning as to where all this will go.
Yeah, and I think with the geopolitical risk, it's quite interesting. They're almost interdependent, or they're connected but not connected. The geopolitical stuff and then the economic stuff, and what you kind of just touched on before is almost like an intersection, right? Where we think of natural gas, we'll just use electricity or use coal or use something else, but we forget that it's not just an energy supply, it's actually a commodity which is used in the manufacturing process. And that's where there's a convergence in the economic realm, which is relevant for us as everyday investors, because that changes the entire dynamics. So going to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I want to just get a feel for what you think of the mobilization of 300,000 troops and just how relevant, how significant of an event you think that is.
So it's another inflection point in this war. The war's gone through a number of phases, and this is the latest phase, maybe the fourth phase, you could say. The first phase was the initial invasion, where Russia invaded through three directions into Ukraine, but basically failed. They thought they'd knock Ukraine out in a week, and they failed in achieving that because of a bunch of logistics issues, command and control issues, probably just poor morale on the ground. You know, the Ukrainians were really willing to fight, and a lot of these Russian men had just been thrown into this meat grinder and, didn't want to be there. You then have Russia in the second phase switch to try to take the east and south, and it's been partly successful in that. If you look at current maps, 4 regions mostly under their control in the east and south of Ukraine. Then it turns into kind of this artillery war where the Russians are just along the front lines where they're fighting Ukraine in the east. They're just bombing things into the ground, cities, towns, the Ukrainian military who are having to retreat a lot, but it's quite incremental. The Ukrainians then get these sophisticated artillery called high mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, that are incredibly sophisticated and can shoot over the Russian lines and start disrupting Russian logistics, command and control, air defenses, and everything. And that's when we really started to see a kind of what looked like quite static lines in the east. You might remember for the last few months, not much seemed to really be happening in this war. There were just these lines. The two sides were basically bombarding each other slowly, making incremental gains here and there, but nothing significant was changing. Then a couple weeks ago, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive that in the north that was incredibly successful. It was a bait and switch. They were building up in the south, so the Russians switched lots of forces in the south. And when that happened, the Ukrainians then attacked in the north against very poorly manned lines, a kind of rump force, if you will, in the north that the Russians are left behind, and pushed that back. And that really led to an inflection point for Russia, because in theory, this should be Russia's war. Russia has a population of 150 million people. They can call up potentially 25 million men if they absolutely had to. They have immense industrial capacity. They have far more firepower than Ukraine. Yet Ukraine, with 45 million people, a much smaller economy, and a now devastated economy, has really been able to match the Russians, if not overpower them in a number of key battles. And in this offensive, were much more successful than anyone thought. The Russian lines basically collapsed in the north. Therefore, this led to kind of a crisis moment for the Russians. What do you do? Does Putin capitulate? It's impossible really to see that, given the loss of life, the economic costs, and everything Russia has taken so far in this war. And for political reasons, he has said that he is liberating the Ukrainian people from neo-Nazis and so on. And at the least, he said, well, in the eastern part of Ukraine, there are basically people who are Russians, and we are fighting to defend the Russian people, outside our border in Ukraine. So politically, if he was to back down now, it's probably the end of his regime. Worst case, maybe even the end of his life, given, when these dictators fail, they often come to a bad ending. So capitulation didn't seem to be an option for him. He could try to sustain the war based upon the current forces he has on the ground, but with these counteroffensives being successful on the Ukrainian side, it looks like they need more manpower. They also need to be able to rotate people out of the war because people get exhausted, right? You fight a brutal artillery war for months on end, and you probably start to lose your marbles a little bit. You start to get exhausted and so on. So really, Putin's only option was to escalate. That is to initiate this partial mobilization, which he's now done, in which they are calling up 300,000 men. Now, they're probably going to call up actually a lot more than that. This will probably be the first of a number of wave of mobilizations.
Wow.
And we're already hearing about them. They've been sweeping Russia, basically, just grabbing men, chucking them into recruitment offices, into vans and driving them off. And there's also been opposition to this in Russia at multiple levels. So this is when we get into where is all this heading? Because if Putin can pull off this mobilization, even if it isn't perfect, but he can get another 100, 200,000 men into the war zone in the near future, he should be able to stabilize those lines with Ukraine as the winter starts to hit in Europe, which will be towards the end of next month. But it's already getting cold here quite quickly. People have said this has been a really unnaturally cold month in Europe already. So this this winter could be quite severe, and it seems to be starting maybe a bit earlier than expected. Putin will want to get his forces in there before the winter to stabilize the lines with Ukraine, because it's much harder to fight in the winter, as you imagine, with the frost and snow and everything. And then he'll want to trade up all these men over the coming months. And what's quite likely then is 5 months from now, 6 months or whatever, as we come out of winter in Europe, that'll be the next major point. Can the Russians then use these hundreds of thousands of new men they've put in a really effective way? Conversely, even before that, could Ukraine, maybe before Russia can get all these men into the field, will they try launch more counteroffensives? Because, again, a lot of this is political from Putin's point of mind. He's looking to hold on to power. He's looking to get something that he can sell to the Russian people as a success, given how abominably bad this war has gone for them. Not just that, with the mobilization now, this is hitting home for the average Russian people. The average Russian people now, their sons and fathers are going to be going off to war. They're going to start to see body bags coming home. And that kind of strikes at the social contract Putin has with the population, which is, I give you stability. I also give you a bit of repression, and I make sure you have no democracy. But in exchange, you get stability. But it kind of relies upon the average Russian being kind of apathetic, just going along with things. And if people's daily lives are pretty good and maybe their wages are increasing a bit and they can afford, basic goods and maybe some luxury items in the odd holiday, they're willing to put up with that. But now they have to put up with the sanctions, which is affecting their quality of life. They're soon going to have to put up with body bags coming home of their sons and fathers and so on. So this is a test for Putin as well. Can he not just fight this war, but as he escalates and increases the manpower into the war, will the Russian people not turn on him in a significant manner? So the partial mobilization, incredibly significant, both for the battlefield and also for how it could affect Putin's prospects in Russia. Look, I suspect, despite all the news we're seeing, that recruitment centers being firebombed in Russia, apparently dozens of them. They think maybe 500,000 Russian men have left Russia already because they want to get out of the country and avoid the mobilization. 500,000 men, that's a loss of brawn, and it's a loss of brain power and working power. So there's another economic effect for the country. Yeah. But I think despite all of this, most of these men will go to war and they'll do what they're told. They could have low morale. Some of them may surrender to Ukrainian troops, who knows? And no doubt the Western media will blow all that up because, there's kind of a framing that the Western media wants to give us because it's a sort of narrative. But I think this will stabilize the lines for Russia, and we'll just have to see how things play out in the coming months. But as the winter hits, it'll probably just stagnate a bit. And it will be 5 or 6 months from now where we see what really happens next, when those Russian men are actually trained to fight properly.
So going back to the advance that Ukrainians made on Russian forces, pushed them back a little bit. Some would say that was maybe like a David and Goliath moment, or the beginning of it. No one really saw that coming. But what was actually behind that drive in terms of the weapons? Obviously, this isn't just Ukrainian sourced weapons that they had in reserves. They had some help. Where is their help coming from?
Oh, it's coming mainly from the United States, secondly from the Brits, and then thirdly from the Europeans. The Americans had been shuttling to them significant amounts of sophisticated weaponry through Poland especially. And like I talked about earlier, the HIMARS, these high artillery rocket systems, but they've just been getting all sorts of ammunition, vehicles. If you're on Twitter, you can find all sorts of accounts that on a daily basis are showing, look, new LAV deployment in the field from Switzerland. Thank you, Switzerland. That's Ukrainian forces thanking this or that country. So they've just been acquiring all sorts of the most sophisticated weaponry in the world, quite frankly, from NATO countries, with the United States in the lead, passing multiple arms packages. In fact, the Americans have shifted or sent so much of certain types of weaponry that they're starting to run low on stocks of their own. So they're having to start up their industrial base in certain sectors of the military-industrial complex to make sure that they can restore their own arms in the US. But yeah, it's all outside. Look, Ukraine cannot win this war without external support. They would have lost already had they not had that external support. They might have been able to keep Russia from winning the initial invasion, but just in the medium to long term, they cannot win against Russia without all that foreign supplies coming in and so on. And it's not just that, it's also training. Thousands, tens of thousands of these Ukrainians have been trained by NATO forces. In recent months, they've been flown to the UK to get training from the US and UK advisors, and then they get sent back to the field in Ukraine. They receive Western intelligence about Russian movements. So a lot of support coming from the West for you.
So I'm just thinking, if the US is out in front in assistance here, are we not watching World War III? The US is now fighting Russia, or very, very close to it, right?
Yes and no. So it's what we call a proxy war. There are a number of these throughout the Cold War as well, where the Russians and the Americans, they don't want to directly fight one another. They don't want their forces on the ground shooting at one another, because that can rapidly escalate to nuclear war and Armageddon. So what's essentially happened here is Ukraine is their battlefield. The Americans and the West are supporting Ukraine to fight the Russians in this territory, kind of so the Americans don't have to fight the Russians in the territory directly. And that is a major concern surrounding all of this. Putin very early on sent a number of kind of nuclear threat signals to the West, basically saying, do not send your forces in here, or this could lead to nuclear escalation. We've also seen with the announcement of the partial mobilization, Putin has said, we will defend Russian territory and sovereignty with, if we have to, all means at our disposal, which is saying with nuclear weapons if we have to. Now, why that is now germane in a slightly different way as of today or the coming hours is because these annexations, these referendums have gone on in the 4 eastern regions and southern regions of Ukraine, where they voted, we are told, over 80% to be annexed into Russia. Now, Putin will be annexing those territories in the coming hour. Apparently on Russian state TV at the moment, there's like a 24-hour timer that's counting down, and Putin will give a speech where he announces the formal annexation of these territories, which means Russia is swallowing these territories into Russia. They will become part of Russian territory from Moscow's point of view. Putin, by saying we will defend our territory with all means at our disposal, means these 4 territories, in theory, will come under Russia's nuclear umbrella. So again, this is another major political escalation, because Putin is saying, well, these are now Russia. We need to ensure we control them, we dominate them. And right now, 2 of those regions are basically sort of 40% held by the Ukrainians. So there's going to at least have to be more fighting from Russia's point of view to push them out of those regions for them to consolidate these annexed territories. At worst, it's also saying we could use nuclear weapons in or around, or maybe over the Ukrainian border, where there's the Ukrainian border with these nominally new Russian annexed territories, if we feel we need to. So that's where things start to get a bit potentially pear-shaped. And Putin also said in this speech, when he announced the mobilization, he said, and I'm not bluffing. Now, normally you don't have to say that if you have credibility, but Putin has made certain threats before that he has been bluffing on. So to say that, on one hand, we can kind of laugh at it and be like, oh, well, you don't need to say that if you're credible about your nuclear threats. But because the use of a nuclear weapon would be so incredibly escalatory and have such unpredictable consequences for what happens next. We have to take that seriously. And the Americans are taking it seriously. The Europeans are taking it seriously too. So a lot of moving parts, escalatory potential definitely happening here. It's not a direct war between the Americans and Russians. It's a proxy war. That, though, is concerning. There are scenarios where maybe, a missile hits somewhere in Russia from the Ukrainian side that leads the Russians to escalate in a way that NATO then feels it has to respond. Maybe Russia uses a nuclear weapon, and then NATO feels like it has to invade on the side of Ukraine, or the West feels like it needs to use a nuclear weapon in response. Okay, that's the outcome everyone wants to avoid. But there is the potential this could escalate to an actual Americans/NATO military confrontation with Russia.
And it's an interesting switch as well, because instead of Russia coming into another country, they've effectively swallowed that country or a portion of it, specifically where the conflict resides. So now it's actually technically a battle on Russian soil, right? So if there are foreign influences arming those forces on Russian soil, then that threat goes well beyond just Ukraine theater, right? It could actually go over the Atlantic or over the poles and potentially the US. Would that be pushing it too far?
Right now, I think it's pushing it too far. We need to realize that Putin isn't suicidal. He would likely only use nuclear weapons in two instances here. One would be in a kind of demonstration effect, I think. Maybe the battle war continues not to go very well for Russia, and Putin is fearful that he's going to eventually lose. But he doesn't want to nuke Poland or the US or even probably maybe Kiev or something like that, because it could lead to a massive escalation, and he would frankly just lose a war against NATO. He might be able to destroy much of NATO in the world with his nuclear weapons, but he'll be destroyed in turn. But he could demonstrate a nuclear weapon. Maybe he would test one in the Black Sea, or test one somewhere in Ukraine territory that's maybe on some military base or something like that. It would be to show the West, hey, look, we are dead serious right now. We are escalating right to this level. You better back down, or you better compromise with us, or what have you. I think that could happen. I think it's unlikely, okay? Outlining unlikely scenarios, but we still need to consider. So one would be a demonstration effect. The second, I think, would be if Putin was really losing. Okay, maybe the Ukrainians launch more counteroffensives before this mobilization can really support the Russian lines. And Putin is fearful that he's losing these territories. And if he loses these territories, he probably loses his regime. He maybe loses his life in Russia because of the stakes involved, and that he has bet his fortunes on this war now. So that would be some kind of situation where he is personally under threat. The Russian lines are completely collapsing. It's clear the Russians have actually lost this war. And then he's like, okay, I have no other option but to escalate to using nuclear weapons, maybe to destroy Kiev or to attack a Western country. But again, I think that's just it's a worst case scenario. It would be a completely last ditch. Putin has nothing to lose, and he makes that decision. I think we're quite far from that as well. I think no one wants to give Russia these regions, right? NATO, the US, Ukraine, they've all already said they will never recognize these annexations. But do we want to fight a war for the next 5 years against Russia when we're already seeing all the economic consequences of it? Or we might even be just at the beginning of the economic consequences of it if it drags on for years, where it could escalate to nuclear war. So eventually there could be some compromise point, because the worst case outcomes, we don't want to go anywhere near, right?
So there's this demonstration effect. There's this desperation effect. Is there anything else that, I guess, and there's also just the element of, hey, they made a mistake and no one actually intended on doing it, but they set off a course of events and you just can't back out. But there's also like different types of weapons that they could set off, even like an EMP blast or something like that, right?
Potentially catastrophic cyber attacks. I mean, catastrophic is maybe an extreme word, but they could try launch cyber attacks against the West to shut down major infrastructure. Thing like an EMP, they could set that off, and that would shut down, in theory, all of our digital devices, in parts of the world. So there are other forms of escalation in space. I mean, the space domain is critically important to the functioning of modern economies, to the modern military, to to our daily lives. We don't often realize it, but space is critical with all the satellites up there. There could be some kind of attack or explosion in space. So there are kind of major steps Russia could take short of nuclear weapons to escalate without escalating to that potentially final step of a nuclear weapon. Maybe even short of that, what we saw a few days ago was these pipelines that go from Russia in the north through the Baltic Sea to Germany, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. There's 2 pipelines. Then a number of kilometers separate from that, there's Nord Stream 2, which is 2 pipelines as well. Now, Nord Stream 2 was basically finished just before this war began, in the expectation that this would be a new major gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. Once the war began, Germany said, we are not turning on this new pipeline. So what's now happened is Nord Stream 1 is still functional, but only gas is going through one of those pipelines. And even then, the capacity has been turned down a lot by Russia because it wants to use the energy card against Germany and Europe in this coming winter. But three of the actual pipes, the 2 for Nord Stream 2, were blown up. Well, holes were punched in them, significant holes were punched in them. So Nord Stream 2, both pipes there are currently damaged. And one of the pipelines of Nord Stream 1, the one that isn't being used really, was also damaged. The one pipeline, which gas is still flowing from Russia to Germany, was left intact. Who did this? No one exactly knows, but the strongest theories is that actually it was Russia sending a signal that, hey, look, we can escalate in these other ways. We can attack energy infrastructure. And there's lots of energy infrastructure still from Russia that goes overland to Europe, through Ukraine, for example. Those are on land. They are much more vulnerable than these sea pipelines that were just attacked a few days ago. So Russia potentially is sending a signal like, okay, Europe, we're still giving you some gas. We can destroy parts of this infrastructure and it'll hurt you a lot more than it will us. Russia is also trying to redirect a lot of its oil and gas away from Europe now to diversify because of this war. So in one sense, it seems crazy for Russia to blow up pipelines that have cost a lot of money that could deliver Russia great income in the future if this war, dies down in time. But again, Russia's in a bit of a desperate situation. Russia is trying to increase all the leverage it can over Europe in this coming winter because it wants European countries to stop supporting Ukraine. It wants European countries to kind of give up. It wants European countries to just say, hey, we need the oil and gas. Let's do a deal with Russia. It wants European publics to get angry because they can't, warm their homes or take care of their old parents down the street because they can't warm their homes and so on. There's already been a spike in energy usage in Germany amongst the German population, despite the German government telling them you need to cut back now because we need to preserve as much of the supply as we have for the coming winter. So that's what Russia's betting on as well, that we are just so used to our pretty cozy lives. The Europeans, they have incredible internal heating in all their homes, basically, across the continent because they've good infrastructure and they have severe winters and they're just used to having warm houses. I mean, my wife, when she came to New Zealand, was shocked that many of our homes are cold and many of our homes don't have internal heating. Here. Yeah. Foreigners are always shocked when they come to New Zealand to see how we live through the winter, right? That we have mold and we're willing to put up with this kind of thing. The Europeans, this is just a foreign concept to them. There was, a few weeks ago, 70,000 people protesting in Prague about the war from what I gather, the far left and the far east of the political spectrum, but still 70,000 people. And they were calling for the Czech Republic to withdraw from NATO, to do a deal with Russia because of cost of living concerns and energy price concerns, and basically to become neutral in the war in Ukraine. There's been protests already in Germany, quite small, only a few thousand people so far. But this is already happening as we are probably just getting into when this war is going to start to really bite Europe when it comes to the energy situation. So things like that, this is what we may see, right? We can talk about EMPs going off, tactical nuclear weapons being used, but those are quite extreme escalatory steps. What Russia is probably going to do is inch up the pressure over time, find different ways on the continent that it can surprise everyone, shock everyone, and damaging these pipelines was potentially one of those escalatory steps.
Right. So it's kind of like in between those major escalatory sort of dramatic events, or up until that potentially happens, it's kind of like a game of chicken, more or less, where they're really just waiting for winter to really bite. And then that's where they're counting on civil unrest. No doubt they'll be potentially instrumental in trying to stoke that even more, right? Like just to really spark that off with social media stuff and cyber attacks and all that sort of thing. And then hopefully how would they actually break away? Like, would it just be a matter of the politicians approaching Russian politicians and saying, let us do a deal like what you say, give us some oil, turn the lights back on, so to speak?
Well, yeah. So Hungary, for example, their president, Viktor Orban, is basically pro-Russian, you could say. Throughout this entire war, he's been saying that what the European Union is doing is like suicide. It's a self-inflicted wound, and that Europe should not be sanctioning Russia and so on. So you have one example of a president who already is defying the rest of the European Union. So yeah, I guess it's hard to see how it would play out, whether it would be certain governments basically collapsing because they've lost the support of the people writ large and new politicians coming to power. It could be just some politicians saying, well, look, we really don't like this war. We don't like what's going on, but we have to compromise because we need to heat our homes and we need to save our industrial economic sectors and so on. It can be Russia, no doubt, will look to use social media, flood and bots, try to manipulate the discourse and so on, as they have been doing around the world in recent years, around elections and so on. And, there are parts of populations in Central Europe that are somewhat sympathetic to Russia, that still have a nostalgic view of the Soviet Union time.
Right.
Now, they are a minority, but, for example, in the Czech Republic, for much of the last 10 years, there's been two guys in power, a guy called Babiš and a guy called Zeman. One is the prime minister, one is the president. But Babiš is incredibly pro-American. Zeman is incredibly pro-Russian. So in the last 6 years, when I've been coming here, I've always found the politics of the Czech Republic to be this kind of two-faced thing, where people kind of want to be European, though they're a bit suspicious of Brussels and the external power and regulations that come with that. They support America. But you have one of the chief politicians who keeps getting re-elected, who is vehemently pro-Russian, very skeptical of the United States. Now, with the war, he has been forced to criticize Russia. But that's basically the very first time for the last 6 years. He's been incredibly pro-Russian. And again, he's re-elected over time. So there is some constituency in countries like the Czech Republic that are actually somewhat sympathetic to Russia. And from conversations with younger people here, they say it's because the Russians are really good at using social media, information warfare to kind of brainwash a lot of older Czech people that, Russia is a friendly country. It's a Slavic country. It's like part of our civilizational brothers and sisters. And remember the Soviet times. Soviet times weren't that bad because everything was free basically and so on. So there's kind of a nostalgia here that does percolate in some countries a bit below the surface, does sometimes come out in the form of protests like we saw in Prague a few weeks ago. And as I said, there are some politicians who are not hostile to Russia, that are actually pretty friendly to Russia. But generally speaking, they are not dominant. But we'll just have to see what happens in the months to come. We're all just watching to see how this plays out now.
Yeah. And then going back to the information warfare piece as well, from a normal consumer of news media, let's say, from a perspective of an everyday person trying to understand what's going on, there's a variety of sources. And you've been really helpful because you've given me a long list. I'm going to include it in the show notes for our audience if they want to actually reach out to you, or if they want to go to some of these sources that you recommend. Like that's going to be helpful to get both sides of the story. But going back to the information warfare piece, how can we discern between like the Russian or the American propaganda pieces? Like, are there obvious giveaways that we can recognize to filter that out in case we come across that?
Where you are most likely to come across it is on social media and probably on Twitter. Now, I intentionally follow lots of like pro-Ukrainian accounts who do have a certain narrative, and every day they are posting clips of, Ukraine military successes and pointing out all the shortfalls and problems in the Russian military and about Putin's decision making and command and control situation and so on in Ukraine. But I also follow lots of pro-Russian accounts, because they are giving you a kind of through the looking glass view of the world, where they also are playing a bit of a propaganda role, but they are also sharing details and evidence and opinions that you will not read anywhere in the Western media, But I intentionally try to get that, because I want to get as much of a macro view of what's going on as possible. And if I'm just reading Western news sources and following pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian accounts on Twitter, you are within a bubble, right? Now, that bubble, I think, is much more honest than the Russian bubble. I think, journalists in the West do try to do their job. They do try to follow the evidence and so on. But there is also just a lot of sharing of things, unsubstantiated things. Even the New Zealand media does this quite a lot. For obvious reasons, the New Zealand media doesn't have lots of journalists crawling all over Europe and the Ukraine and so on. So a lot of the time, you'll see NZ Herald or Stuff just sharing articles from Reuters or the Financial Times or whatever, which are pretty good outlets. But it doesn't mean everything in those stories is completely fact-checked by the New Zealand media first. Of course not. It's very hard to discern, I would say, Darcy. I would just say maybe it's less actual outright propaganda in the West that we face, where stories and information is being contorted or fictionalized to try and sway Western opinion. It's more of, I would say, just kind of broad narratives, and then a kind of form of vetting that probably takes place amongst editorial teams in Western newspapers, Western news websites, where they wake up every day and they say, what articles on Ukraine are we going to play today? Okay, here are the options we have, and all these options are kind of pretty obviously pro-Ukraine, the successes of Ukraine, and all about how bad the Russian military has been, about Putin's poor decision making and so on. But they're very rarely going, okay, well, let's try find some news stories from kind of the Russian point of view, or that are actually giving us a contrarian take. So I'll just give you an example. This Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north that was very successful a couple of weeks ago, apparently the Ukrainians would have lost something like 20 to 30,000 men in that offensive. That's a good chunk of men, okay? And all we heard about is the Russian lines collapsing, the Russians running in disarray, the poor morale of the Russian soldiers, which was probably all true. But I've also read more than one account that, the Russians managed to fire down massive amounts of artillery to create kind of killing fields for some of this Ukrainian advance. But I have not seen a single sort of what I would call mainstream Western news source that has reported upon the death and damage the Ukrainians suffered in that successful counteroffensive. So sometimes it's these data points that when you're just looking at a whole array of information that pop up, you can't always believe them, right? Because there could be some actor out there who has an agenda and they want to make something up or embellish something to get a certain propaganda effect. But when I start to see a data point like that, maybe 20,000 Ukrainians died, and I see it come from multiple sources, not just pro-Russian sources, but even a couple in the West, but they're not necessarily mainstream sources, I start to think, well, okay, there could be something else that's going on here. So you've just got to try and widen your information scope as far as you can. You need to be willing to put up with sometimes viewpoints or stories that you personally might find a bit objectionable or even a bit immoral, and just filter through to try look for the data, really, the actual information. And so this very much goes, I imagine, for an investor, right? An investor, in theory, shouldn't be getting too caught up in the narrative and the ideological preferences they have about the war in Ukraine. They should be trying to look for the evidence, the data, to triangulate and so on. And that does mean you need to try and put aside your own ideological framework or sense of moral perspective as much as you can. You can have that as much as you want, but in terms of your analysis, in terms of actually trying to figure out what's happening in the world, you want to set all that aside as much as possible. And we all struggle with it, right? We're all humans. We all do have biases. But the more you can do that, I think the better you can get an actual real world view of what's happening in some of these geopolitical crises.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good reminder. Just to think broadly, don't be offended, put your moral lens to the side for a second, and you might be able to see things for the facts, for what they are, filter out all the other rubbish, right?
Yep. And I do this on Twitter. I have certain political views on things, but I will follow people who have the absolute opposite view to me because I want to know what they're thinking. But they sometimes will be coming across facts and sharing them that my side of the political spectrum may not be sharing because it's inconvenient for my side. Do you know what I mean? People filter evidence based upon what supports their pretty narrow-minded political viewpoints. And if you're just stuck in your one little bubble, you actually are missing lots of evidence, perspectives that the other side will be sharing. So I just try to cross all sides of the political or geopolitical spectrum.
Yeah. That's hard though, isn't it? It's hard for your brain, right? Like that hurts. Okay, well, that's a really, really good bird's eye view summation of what's happening in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But in our remaining time, I just want to kind of come a little bit closer towards home, where it feels almost too close. China, it's been asserting itself in the South China Seas. I'm wondering what's going to happen next with Taiwan. It looked really scary before when Nancy Pelosi decided to come for a little bit of a visit. And then when she left, it kind of felt like she was being thrown under the bus to a certain extent. Well, that was the way I was interpreting it anyway. And it really feels strange. Like it kind of just feels like it's this weird, confusing game that the U.S. is playing with China. And I'm just trying to make sense of it all. Can you help me out here, Reuben? Can you kind of tell me, like bird's eye view, what is going on with China and Taiwan specifically?
So it's complex, but to summarize it, it's that China views Taiwan as a breakaway province, and it has committed itself to reunifying Taiwan with the mainland, and they've actually set a date by 2049. But that's partly arbitrary, okay? Because for all we know, they could look to do it earlier if they saw fortuitous circumstances, a window of opportunity potentially. But they've said by 2049 at the latest, we need to reunify Taiwan with us. They've said we want to do that peacefully. That's what China wants to do. That's its hope. But it is willing to do it militarily if it absolutely has to. And it is building out its military in a way that's very much focused on retaking Taiwan militarily if it has to. So what happened a number of months ago is that Nancy Pelosi, the outgoing Speaker of the House for the Democrats, who's retiring, I believe, we'll see about that, but she went to Taiwan to show her support for Taiwan's continued independence from China. This set off a big controversy because even though it was signaled ahead of Pelosi's visit, I guess most of us were just distracted and not paying attention. So when it became clear that she actually was going, it shocked a lot of us. China protested vehemently. After she landed and left, China actually basically shut down all the naval territory around Taiwan and conducted about a week of military drills around Taiwan, basically to show Taiwan and the world, hey, look, we can blockade Taiwan here. We can, if we have to, invade Taiwan. Where it got a bit confusing was that Nancy Pelosi is not part of the executive branch, right? That's Biden and his administration, even though she's part of the Democratic Party that Biden is the head of, the chief of. There are rumors, no one knows exactly what happened, but Biden apparently might have told Pelosi directly, please do not go. We do not think this is in our interests. We are trying to negotiate with China on trade issues and so on. And Pelosi may have gone anyway. So formally, what we're led to believe is the Biden administration didn't want her to go. Now, this is when we get into the games within games, though. Biden may very well have endorsed this because he wants China to be a bit uncertain about how America might respond to Chinese belligerence or Chinese invasion. And by sending Pelosi, or at least kind of subtly, quietly endorsing it, but then saying he doesn't endorse it, it leads the Chinese leadership just to think, the Americans are a bit unpredictable over this issue, that if China was to invade, the Americans could militarily look to repulse us, or once the invasion is underway, they may look to interdict us, they may launch strikes against us, especially against the amphibious forces They're going to have to cross the Taiwanese Strait to get there, and amphibious landings are always fraught with danger and very difficult. Biden also has said a number of times now that America would militarily intervene to protect Taiwan. Now, that goes against long-standing American policy of what's known as strategic ambiguity, where America says, well, we formally don't say what we would do. Biden has publicly said a few times that America will defend Taiwan, but then immediately the day after, Biden's officials walk that back and say, oh, no, this isn't a change of policy. We still have the policy of strategic ambiguity. So this can be confusion amongst Biden officials. It could be Biden just going off on his own and just saying stuff, not really thinking about it. But this kind of unpredictable messaging America has used around Taiwan is actually quite consistent now for the last few months, that it makes me think it's an intentional signaling strategy. Biden wants China to be uncertain about how the Americans will react. He could come out and say, no matter what, we will defend Taiwan, and that's the formal policy. But China then has to go, well, geez, we have committed to retaking Taiwan. We have told our public, we have bet our regime on eventually reabsorbing Taiwan. A bit, in a certain way, almost a little bit how Putin has now bet his regime on absorbing part of Ukrainian territory. Chinese nationalism kind of dictates that the Xi Jinping and the Chinese leaders eventually have to reabsorb Taiwan now. And if America says we will defend it militarily, what happens next? You have two completely inconsistent objectives on the Chinese and American sides over Taiwan. Do the Chinese panic and then launch an invasion now because they think, okay, well, we have to grab it while we can? Or you get what I'm getting at here, right? There's a certain line both can reach if the official American policy is to defend Taiwan no matter what. Or perhaps it actually deters China, and China says, oh, geez, we cannot militarily now invade, and we just have to play out the string for as long as possible and hope eventually we can economically reunify, or we can entice the Taiwanese so much through the example of the Chinese economic miracle that the Taiwanese eventually will want to give up their democracy and their liberal society and be reabsorbed into authoritarian China. It's very hard to see why that would occur. It's look at what happened in Hong Kong, where the British gave back Hong Kong to the Chinese, and the Chinese basically agreed to a two systems, one country policy, where Hong Kong would be part of China, but it would have its own democratic system separate to the Chinese system. And we've seen in recent years that China has basically neutered and eliminated now the Hong Kong democracy. It's passed a national security law that basically gives China complete power over Hong Kong. Any elections in the future in Hong Kong will not necessarily be free and fair, and the parties, the leaders the Hong Kong people can choose from will be leaders that China has chosen they can choose from. So it will no longer be free and fair elections. If you're Taiwan, looking at that example, I mean, are you willing just for, a few extra dollars to give up your entire political system? Probably not. So it's a difficult situation around Taiwan right now. And I think the Americans may be intentionally playing a game of unpredictability because they think that's the best way of keeping China uncertain. They don't want to compel China into launching an invasion. So it's a delicate dance.
It's quite interesting. So meanwhile, Taiwan's just having a look at what China is doing, not just what they're saying. And they're going, nah, we're not, you can't sell us the sizzle here. You are not making communism great again over there in Hong Kong. We're not buying it. But meanwhile, I guess there's thinking now about how Putin is behaving, how Xi Jinping is what his orientation is as well. There is probably like a bit of a time bomb ticking, because if we can trust it, there seems to be a lot of negative economic data coming out of China for what it's worth.
Yep.
And so we know that there's probably going to be a lot of civil tension building up there as well. So in Europe, maybe that's towards the energy piece, and will they not cave? But then you've got this population of China that maybe there's food shortages. We don't know, right? If they don't do something now, do they kind of have to wait and go back to the drawing board for quite a while?
I think in the very immediate term, the next year or two, we won't see an invasion. As you say, China has all these domestic economic problems it needs to work through. There's also the issue of what's happened in Russia and Ukraine. Had Russia, absorbed all of Ukraine in the space of a week after the initial invasion, that was the expectation most analysts had, that Russia was going to win this war very quickly and we were going to see Ukraine basically annexed into Russia and the Russian forces would move up to the border with Slovakia and Poland and so on. Had that happened, though, successfully for the Russians, it's quite possible that, maybe there would have been sanctions, but maybe the world just would have been like, oh, well, it's done. The Ukrainians weren't really willing to fight for their national autonomy. Let's get back to business as usual. China might have looked at that and gone, okay, well, the West is right now indecisive and kind of weak in a way. It's not willing to give up its, high standards of living to defend random countries like Ukraine. Why would they do much to defend Taiwan? So I think the Ukrainian example sent a really clear message to China that, hey, okay, if we move on Taiwan soon, we could suffer debilitating sanctions like Russia. Because, China is a bit like the situation Japan has been in for a lot of its history, where it relies upon outside world for so many of its imports, for technology and everything to power its economy. If China is cut off from the world because it invades Taiwan and the West puts on severe sanctions, I mean, that could be the end of the regime. You could have mass unemployment, a kind of collapse of the Chinese economy. For that matter, we'll probably get a collapse of the global economy, right? If China is suddenly removed from the global economic system, I mean, China could trade with Russia and countries in Eurasia, but if it's cut off from the Western world, I mean, you tell me, Darcy, or maybe some of your listeners, some of the viewers could tell us that would lead to economic depression, maybe for the planet. It would be so severe. But regardless, it would cost the Chinese more than it would the rest of the world in the long term. So the sanctions may get put on them. But the Russian example is telling. The Russian example also tells us, it's very hard to conquer a people that don't want to be conquered if they have support from outside powers who can give them sophisticated weaponry. And Taiwan has been receiving weaponry and training from the United States. America could ramp that up. Whether it could sustain that in an actual invasion scenario, I'm not sure, but it could escalate to war, right? And that's what the Americans are saying. The Japanese and the Australians have also said, if China invades, that they will militarily support America too. So again, it's just these unpredictable scenarios, but it doesn't seem to me there's any good outcome in the near term for China to invade. Where eventually this could look rational for China is that some say that, there are a lot of trend lines in China that are going to get worse in time because their demographics are really, really bad. Because of the one child policy in China, some predict their population could be cut in half by the middle of this century. That's some of the worst case analysis coming out now, is that the demographic problems there are so much worse than we even realized they were. So that's when you start getting to scenarios where China might look around and look at the long-term trends, and despite some of the narrative we've had in the Western world in the past 10, 20 years, that China is just this escalating economy that is going to keep going and soon it's going to be 2 times, 3 times larger than the US economy, there's some trend lines that actually look really bad for China. And they may feel that, maybe by 2030, 2040, we expect China to be economic miracle to continue, that actually they'll be facing really significant headwinds. And that unless they make a move sooner rather than later, they may not be able to make a move at all on Taiwan because they'll be facing such bad domestic conditions and trend lines. But again, this is where we can't get deterministic, okay? Even with the Russia-Ukraine situation, all through this conflict, we've been surprised by developments, right? We're surprised that Russia lost the initial opening phases of the war. We were surprised by this recent successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north. The partial mobilization shouldn't have been a surprise given where we were, but I think if you're not paying attention, it probably surprised some people. We can't be too deterministic. Right now, the world has never been as unpredictable as it has been for a number of decades. The last 30 years are probably a bit of a golden age, I would say, Darcy. Economic growth, countries all around the world basically to greater or lesser degrees, agreeing to kind of a form of globalism and free international trade. Trade in some respects in the past few decades has been held above security concerns. What we're now seeing is kind of a shift where many countries are saying, well, no, we now need to take steps in the trading sphere where we place national security concerns ahead of our economic, cost of living concerns. And the Americans maybe really kicked this off under Trump with the trade war against China, where you probably remember at the time, but virtually every economist on the planet was screaming and saying this is a bad move by the United States. Many politicians were saying the same. But that trade war went ahead anyway. That trade war is still in effect on high-tech interactions between the US and China. That has all ceased now. The US is basically forcing all its high-tech companies to withdraw from China or not do any new deals with China. We also saw a few weeks ago some sanctions start to be placed in the aeronautic sphere between China and the US. So we could start to see the broadening of that trade war push into aeronautics, maybe into energy, maybe into agriculture. And, that's economically not great for the US and China, but it damages China more than it does the US. But it's especially not good for the rest of us, Darcy, because if eventually this trade war starts spreading into, say, agriculture, well, we trade. 30% of our trade is with China. A big part of that is just our dairy products and agriculture. If the US trade war moves into that sphere, they will start looking to their allies and partners like New Zealand and basically saying, hey, New Zealand, we also expect you to start upping the game. You're our allies, and we want you to start reducing or cutting off some of your trade interactions with China, because remember, you're on our side, New Zealand,
That's right.
So, we can't be too deterministic about where any of these things are going, but some of the trend lines don't look good within China. They don't look good kind of around China in terms of how countries are treating China, including very close New Zealand allies and partners.
Yeah.
And right now, that seems to be where it's headed. This slow motion decoupling between the US and then perhaps eventually by extension, more of the Western world from China in certain economic sectors. I've never seen things so unpredictable. And just that general recognition that national security concerns are starting to surmount economic concerns. And as investors, if they're not paying attention to this geopolitical game, if they're not at least doing some reading about what's going on, starting to follow some sources that can inform them about the kind of more national security elements of political decision-making, then I think they're flying a little bit blind when it comes to making their decisions. Because I have a friend of mine who, for example, he actually is an investor. All his assumptions basically are that all these geopolitical tensions playing out, business as usual will return very quickly, because countries, investors, economies, politicians, in his mind, they all just want to make money, right? That's the common thing that holds everyone together. But right now, I'm trying to tell him quite strongly, no, I think for the time being, for the next few years, you need to assume business as usual is not going to quickly return.
That's right. I guess it's just this near-term bias back there. We've just come from such a positive 2 years in terms of everything's going up. It's so hard for us to get that. We're so hard for us to get that money cannot just trump this, and that is just all about the money. It's all about the trade, and everybody will ultimately back off if it starts to damage their own economy. No, it's well beyond that, but we're not necessarily seeing it for what it is, are we?
Yeah, and it's politicians who, for example, take the United States. The Democrats and the Republicans are both anti-China now. Okay, it is seen as a political badge of honor to be anti-China, So both sides, there's no China constituency anymore in Washington, D.C. And that's structural for the time being. Could it change in time? Yeah, sure. But for the immediate future, for the next few years, it looks like that's the course we're on.
Yeah, it's almost like the bridges are burnt. It's hard to imagine that things can be reconciled there.
One little potential green shoot here is, Xi Jinping in the coming months, they'll probably re-anoint him for an unprecedented third term, basically leader for life of China. There's possibility there that Xi, once he has secured that, he will feel domestically reassured enough that he can then start to bend a bit on certain issues with the United States. Because a lot of this just comes back to the trade piece for the United States, doesn't it? They look at China's trade practices and say, you've been cheating the system and you're not playing by the World Trade Organization rules or the rules that we want you to play by. But Trump did do the first part of some kind of trade deal with China. I know that wasn't super significant, but the expectation that was going to be followed by a second deal where China would have to make structural reforms economically. So perhaps Xi, once he gets back in again, he will feel he has more room to maneuver and he will be able to give ground a little bit in some of these trading issues with the United States, which actually in the long term could probably benefit the Chinese economy, right? It could bring back much more Western investment and things like that I think they're currently lacking. But it could require some short-term pain for the Chinese people to restructure the economy. But again, if he feels his position is secure, that's where I think maybe we could start to see a bit of a political lessening of tensions between the US and China. And then we start to get back to something a bit more like business as usual of recent years.
That's a really nice green shoot to almost end it on. But I have one more question, just coming right back home to New Zealand here. Yep. I want to get a feel for which way we might go if things started to escalate. And I'm conscious of the fact that a third of our trade is with China, yet our protection apparently comes from the West. And under extreme situations where we may have to choose, what's your view on where we go?
If it's an absolute choice, if it gets to that point, I think we would choose the US and Australia, our allies, for a range of reasons. One is just actually, yes, we're reliant on China for this trade. We could, if we had to, reorient it elsewhere. Look, it probably wouldn't happen overnight, right? That we have sunk costs with China. We have all these businesses that are private businesses that can make their own decisions, that want to keep trading with China because of the free trade agreement and just the big middle class in China they can sell to. But you have to think there are other markets out there that produce could be sent to. There'll be a lot of pain. It might take time. And Jacinda Ardern, if you track the trend lines, she has been pursuing a more we might say, Western line in recent years. Okay. Right. When she came to power, New Zealand was still very much playing this kind of balancing game where we are friendly with everyone. We criticize China a little bit, but we don't go as far as our allies. But that has been escalating a little bit over time. If you look at Jacinda Ardern's wording, she had that recent tour of the United States a few months ago. There is a White House New Zealand press release that Biden and Jacinda Ardern both signed on and released essentially, which just ticks all these areas of common agreement, common alignment, common values, common interests, and so on. And it mentions the South Pacific explicitly and the concern about a potential naval base being established in the South Pacific by China. China isn't named in that part of the statement, but it's clear it's about China, given things going on in the South Pacific. And which it says, the parties to this agreement or the statement, the US and New Zealand, are concerned about a potential naval base that could shift the balance of power in the South Pacific. There's critique of China in the South China Sea and about what's happened in Hong Kong and around Taiwanese issues. There's a big global market out there beyond China. Clearly, we don't want to go up the Chinese market, but if we had to, we would, I think.
Does New Zealand have any strategic significance to the US in terms of them having a larger presence here in some way? Like you mentioned, maybe China having a base somewhere in the South Pacific. Do you think that would result in a large US presence ever residing here in New Zealand?
Well, what's happened as of, I think, yesterday, the White House held a 2-day summit for Pacific Island leaders. And there are a number of meetings there. New Zealand and Australian officials were there in an observer capacity. But the US now is basically going to chuck billions of dollars at the South Pacific. That's part of the agreement. That's part of, there was a joint statement or agreement that was just released. I haven't had time to catch up on, Darcy. Wow. So we are going to see more American aid flooding into the region. They are expanding the number of their basically embassies in the region, I think from 6 to 9. So whether we will see more directly in New Zealand of an American presence, I'm not sure, but we should in the coming years, if all this actually plays out, the Americans end up spending these billions of dollars, we will see more of an American presence in the South Pacific, which is basically the same thing from our point of view. It's the Americans returning to the region in greater force, if you will, even if it largely is diplomatic and economically. It could be militarily. Let's wait and see. Often what comes with diplomatic and economic support for parts of the world does come with also security and military support as well. Maybe China tries to make a move somewhere else, a counter move somewhere in the South Pacific, because the Solomon Islands are very friendly with China right now and recently did a kind of security agreement with China. What we are looking for, though, is a free trade agreement with the Americans, right? If we want to be able to diversify our trade, there's a big market out there that we haven't got a free trade agreement with the United States, which is basically a friendly country. We have a lot of strategic interests with them. We have common history of a sort, common values, and so on. New Zealand really wants that free trade agreement, I think. How we get that is the question, because to get that, there'll have to be a kind of, you might say, a cost, right? There's a reason why Australia has a free trade agreement with the Americans, because they are in lockstep with the Americans on practically every issue internationally. And strategically, they are willing to base American troops. They did the AUKUS security agreement where they are going to build or purchase nuclear submarines from America. But there's actually a lot more that's part of that agreement. It's on AI, it's on quantum technology, it's on increasing American military and naval deployments through Australia. It's purchasing all sorts of incredible American, very expensive, sophisticated American military equipment. New Zealand, we haven't been willing to go as far as Australia yet. And that's probably the missing piece. If we want that free trade agreement, they're probably going to go, okay, what are you going to give us?
Exactly.
We're not just going to give it to you. And because it's going to require significant domestic political costs on the American side because of the agricultural industry, the agricultural lobby in Washington, D.C., they do not want our farmers getting access to the American market.
Right.
So, there's something there. We'll just have to see if New Zealand governments are willing to pay that price. And this is where potentially individuals do matter. Jacinda Ardern, she may actually not be willing to pay that price. And that can be for a range of reasons. It can also be because part of the cost will be potentially putting us offside with China. Yeah. And Jacinda Ardern, as I said, has been slowly taking a more pro-Western tack, but she does always say that she still wants there to be room for diplomacy. She doesn't want the world breaking down into kind of Cold War camps. She wants to ensure New Zealand's foreign policy remains inclusive. And this is all signaling to China as well that, hey, we don't want to become an enemy. Hey, we do want to maintain some independence from Australia and the United States in our foreign policy. But there are potentially other New Zealand leaders who might take a slightly different tack on that issue, right? Jacinda Ardern right now is still trying to do this balancing act.
I think so. Yeah, it's getting narrower and narrower. Do you think New Zealand needs to revisit the question of our nuclear-free status?
It would only be worth revisiting if something like that was part of the conditions the Americans put forward and said, okay, New Zealand, you want a free trade agreement? Boom, here's our list of demands. One of them is get rid of your anti-nuclear legislation. If that was on the table, we don't know if it is. If it is, then I think it's worth seriously considering. But short of that, the Americans have said that is no longer an issue for them. That's what they publicly said. Privately, maybe it is still an issue for them. That's what they publicly said. So if it's not an issue, why revisit it? We are not going to get nuclear submarines. We could look to join the AUKUS agreement in some capacity on the technology sharing side of things. Some of our officials have actually said that already. But if there's no reason to get rid of that and New Zealanders still feel some emotional attachment to that nuclear legislation, I don't see why we shouldn't keep it. But I will tell you, Darcy, younger New Zealanders barely even know about it. Okay, it is generally older New Zealanders who still feel that attachment to it. My young students today, they have no real awareness of it. So there could be a generational change. At the same time, younger New Zealanders are also very they're very active on climate change issues, and the nuclear element could be attached to that potentially. So in New Zealand domestic politics, if one of our governments was threatening or they were campaigning on getting rid of the anti-nuclear legislation, that could be an issue that the other party could use against them. So often domestic politics complicates what may be the most rational decision, right? Because
often, always.
So watch this space.
That's awesome. Well, I really, really appreciate your time. It's always so easy having a chat to you because it feels like there's no question off limit because you can go there, you know it all. Really,
That's
really appreciate it.
It's my day-to-day bread and butter.
It's right. It's my job just to be curious. So that's the easy job. No, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll catch you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Darcy. Great to chat.